welcome to Money and Me. My guest this week is one of Britain's best known and best loved sports commentators who's been involved in everything from the Olympics to rowing, from rugby to Countdown, perhaps best known of all, of course, for Wimbledon tennis. His name is John Inverdale. John, welcome to Money and Me.
Well, I'd love to be here. I like your office.
Thank you very much.
I like the view.
Not bad, is it?
Not bad.
It's not Broadcasting House, that's for sure. So you were born in Plymouth, the son of a Royal Navy dentist, I think. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing and whether things like money were ever discussed in the family.
I don't think the word ever crossed my mind until I probably left university, actually.
Right.
I mean, my folks, we lived in different places all the time. Sort of 18 months here, 2 years there, lived out in the Far East for a few years, came back to Hampshire, then went to school in Bristol, then went to university in Southampton and at Cardiff. So you were sort of always dotting around. I always think it's very interesting. It's one of those, when you get to a certain stage in life, you sort of yearn. I think you do yearn for roots. You know, when somebody says to you, "Where's your home?" and you haven't really got one, you can't say, "That is where I am from." I do think you're missing out on something, but conversely, I think if you've lived in the same place your whole life, you've missed out as well. Because I think if you move endlessly, you by the very nature of your life, you have to be a bit more gregarious. You have to make friends, otherwise you find yourself being quite lonely. But I think when you get to a certain stage, when people say, "Where exactly are you from?" I say, I don't know really. I kind of say London now because I've been here for 30 years, but I wouldn't say this is home.
Right.
I'm still looking for home.
Okay. But what would your earliest memories be in terms of when you thought you might want to be in journalism, in commentating? It's not the obvious career choice. Where did that come to?
No, it's not. I mean, a guy called Alan Gibson, who was one of the very first voices on Test Match Special, I think in 1949, he was a friend of my father's because he'd worked on the Western Morning News down in Plymouth. And he came round for dinner one night. And he'd just come back from an Ashes tour to Australia, which were real tours in those days that went on for months, sometimes for years it felt like. And he'd just come back and he just spent the whole of the dinner, 3-4 hours, talking about how he'd been in Sydney and been in Perth and just been watching cricket. And then he filed some reports and then he went to the bar. And I was, I think, 13 or something. And I thought, that sounds like quite a good life to me. Can people apply for these jobs? And he said he fell into it in the way that people of that generation tended to. It's now a much more kind of clinical operation to get to that stage by doing media studies degrees and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, so I made the conscious decision then that I thought, right, I've got to be the editor of the school newspaper. And then I went to university and I was editor of the university newspaper. And then after that, I graduated at just the wrong time because Margaret Thatcher's first battle, in many ways, was with the newspaper industry or the print industry.
That's right.
And so my first job, well, I applied for endless jobs on heaven knows how many, literally hundreds of newspapers, literally from Aberdeen to Penzance. And the absolute nadir one morning in the summer of 1979 was getting 13 rejections in the post in the same day, which I remembered vividly. I remember, this cascade of letters through the letterbox and the dog going mad because there were so many letters there. And me thinking, on the law of averages, one of these is going to say, "We quite like the cut of your jib, at least come for an interview." And every single one said thanks, but no thanks. And that was a very, very low moment when I thought I was never going to get a job in the industry at all. And then I did get offered a job by Northcliffe newspapers, as they were then, and I went for an interview in London, and they said, "Do you mind, if we were minded to give you a job, would you mind where we sent you?" And I thought that was opening me up with the opportunity to specify somewhere, and them saying, "No, get lost." So I said, "No, send me anywhere." And literally the following Monday, I got a phone call saying, "We've got a job for you in Lincoln. Would you like it?" I said, "Absolutely. Always wanted to go to Lincoln." Put the phone down, and the first thing I did, absolutely the first thing I did, was I went outside, I got the map out the car. I thought, where the hell is Lincoln? And I ended up spending 6 incredibly happy years there. So it's funny how the way these things turn out.
It is, but also, in a sense, it may not have felt at the time, but it seems like some fairly meteoric progress because I think you were still in your 20s when you started working for Radio 2 in sport, weren't you?
Yeah, I was 28. Having said that, that was quite I was quite young then, but you'd be geriatric now because everything's moved on, you know, and people, you know, work. I think if you got onto national radio before you were 30, you know, you were the exception that proved the rule really in those days. Yes, I was. I did the early morning stuff, you know, getting up at 4:50 in the morning, but I'd done that on local radio for several years as well. And I think that actually one of the legacies of doing that for so many years, I mean, I'm sure that if anybody who's watching this who has any kind of knowledge of these things, they may sound talking complete rubbish, but I do think doing early shifts and getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning for 6, 7 years, I think it really impacts on your sleep patterns. I've never been a great sleeper ever since. And I just wonder if that's the legacy of that, because the panic, it's absolute sheer fear that you're going to sleep through the clock. Because if you sleep through the clock, you know, it's not like other jobs in a sense that somebody can always answer the phone for you. If you're going to be on the radio and you sleep through the clock, there's nobody there to do it, you know. And I had one absolute awful experience. I can remember the date, because you remember the date when these things kind of thing happens, but it was November the 22nd, 1986. November the 22nd is a very significant day in the sporting world because it was in 2003 England won the Rugby World Cup, yeah, against Australia in Sydney. But actually when I think of November the 22nd, I always think of 86, which was the day that I was doing the breakfast show on local radio, and I used to, on a Thursday, allow myself one lunchtime pint a week. Because you always, if you do a breakfast show, and I'm sure anybody from little local radio stations to Chris Evans and all points in between would say the same thing. If you're doing a daily breakfast show, you desperately want the Friday programme to be really good. Because then over the weekend, you've got 2 days to say, actually, I wasn't too bad on Friday, as opposed to mulling over the fact that it wasn't very good and you can't wait for Monday to rectify the wrongs of Friday, if you like. So I used to have a routine that on a Thursday, I would go to the pub. The pub was called the Generous Britain. I'd have one pint in there, and I'd go to bed, wake up, go rugby training on the Thursday night, and then feel replenished and ready to go on the Friday. But on this particular Thursday, I had my pint, I went to bed, I woke up, looked at the clock. It was November. It said 5 to 6, and I thought it was 5 to 6 the following morning, and I was on air 5 minutes later. And I was just I was just completely combobulated by fear and panic and oh my God, no mobile phones or anything. You know?
Yeah.
And I jumped in the car, drove 100 yards down the road, crashed straight into 3 vehicles that were coming towards me because it was 5 to 6 in the evening. And I thought it was 5 to 6 the next morning and nobody was on the road. And I was half asleep and I just stood at the wheel, or sat at the wheel, as all these people were banging on the side of the door, going, you know, what's wrong with you? And I just stood there going, what have you done, you idiot? What, you know? And I think all those, I'm sure a lot of people who work around here are on the, you know, they're on the 6:03 every morning or something. I think in the end that cannot be good for you. It must mess you up in some way or other.
Absolutely.
You know?
So, but then you progressed into Radio 5 and a lot of sports coverage there, and then very shortly after that into television. So how did that transition to TV come about? Was that just a lucky break?
Yeah, it was totally a lucky break. It was a phone call at home. This will make me sound like a really modern man when I wasn't at all, but at the time. But in 1988-9, BSB, British Satellite Broadcasting, and Sky were the first contenders in the cable satellite war. And a guy who worked for BSB, who I'd met at some function or other, and he was an ex-BBC person, rang me up, and I was doing the ironing in the way that you did in those happy, you know, single days when someone had to do it. And the phone went, and this guy called Nick Hunter was on the phone. He said, "Hello, Nick Hunter here. I'd like to talk about a presentation opportunity in television." Yeah. And I went, "Nick, off," put the phone down because I thought someone was just pretending. And then he rang me back about half an hour later, and I said, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Yeah." I went for a screen test, and a fortnight later, myself and Richard Keys were the first 2 broadcasters on British Satellite Broadcasting. Yeah. And then, of course, a few months, or 18, however long ago it was after that, suddenly, in that amazing book, I don't know if you've ever read it, called Dished, you know, if you're talking about financial, you know, wizardry, and also how it's, you know, it's almost like a game of Russian roulette, how BSB blinked on the Friday when Sky were going to blink on the Monday. And if they hadn't, and if they'd said, you know, this board meeting on that Friday afternoon, if they'd said, look, I tell you what, let's sleep on it over the weekend, and then we'll reconvene on Monday or Tuesday next week and decide whether we're going to jack it in. And if Sky had met on the Monday, who knows how different broadcasting would have been. It's a fascinating book, and we were right in the middle of it, and suddenly, one moment we were employed, and the next moment you were out.
But at least you'd made the break on the television.
Yeah, at least, and the great thing about doing it, with all due respect to everybody who was involved in that time, and we all knew it when we were doing it, the audiences were beyond negligible. So you could be absolutely hopeless, but you were learning on the job.
Yeah.
And I'm sure. I don't have a single VHS, as it would be, of any of those programs, which I think is probably a good thing.
Excellent.
But if I did, I'd look at them and probably cringe, But you've got to start somewhere, and and if you look what satellite television has done now, especially in the context of sport, I mean, it has revolutionised our lives, and those old people talk about the good old days when the only live football match on television was the FA Cup. Those weren't the good old days. That was awful. It was the fact, it was terrible. The fact that match of the day was all you had, and that was it every week. So I think that the range of choice that we have at the moment now, and the way it's covered, is just fantastic.
Fantastic. Well, we'll talk more about your television career in a moment. For now, John Inverdale, thank you very much. Join us again in just a few moments. Welcome back. In the first half, we learned about how John progressed from radio into television just around the time of the satellite wars. But then it became very mainstream, John, didn't it? You became really a fixture on our television, especially with things like Today at Wimbledon.
Yeah, it sort of started in the early to mid 90s, and then I was sort of playing box and cocks with radio and television. And if I look back on those days now, kind of like 93 to 2008. I don't really know how I had time for anything else because I was so busy, and I loved it. The one thing I would always say, and it's quite interesting. I've watched a few of these programs, and it's quite interesting how people talk about work. What is the definition of work? For me, work has just been fun. I think that's the key thing. I don't ever recall genuinely waking up in the morning and thinking, God, I wish I wasn't doing that. And that is a ludicrously fortunate position to be in.
Not even at the time of the controversy after the comments about Marion Bartoli.
Well, those were difficult times. I mean, when you're the subject of a lot of media furore, it's a very strange world to be in the eye of a storm when often you're on the touchline, if you like, looking in on things. But it's a slightly bizarre world being on radio, especially on radio, not so much television because there's too many people involved in television. But radio is quite a singular world. Okay, there's producers and there's this, that and the other, but fundamentally it's you and a microphone. It's a very intimate world. And you can lose yourself. All the rest of the world can be happening around you. But in that moment when the red light's on and you're talking about whatever it might be, or you're interviewing somebody, or reading this, that and the other, you're just lost in a world, in your own little world, a world that you're sharing with your listeners. I think that's the absolute key thing. It's our world. It's not my world. It's our world. And for other things, just kind of fade away. It's very strange. The moment you say, well, thanks very much for listening and see you next week, or tomorrow, or whatever it might be, suddenly, click, the real world comes and hits you on the head again. But it is a kind of an escape from everything else that's going on, whatever everything else might be.
But there must have been some satisfaction from the fact that, eventually they changed the whole format of Today at Wimbledon, and there was a huge reaction against it. There was a Bring Back John campaign, and lo and behold, you did come back.
Yeah, well, I think there's a Bring Back John campaign, a bit like, Brexit campaigns and things like that. They get listened to or they don't get listened to. I mean, I never went away. I mean, it's one of those. It's a bit of an urban myth that I suddenly wasn't there. I actually went from presenting straight to commentating, so I didn't ever miss a Wimbledon. But that didn't kind of fit the narrative of what the agenda that some people had. But I mean, Wimbledon is an amazing event, and it is one of the when you do something for a very long time, and I've done Wimbledon. This will be my 34th Wimbledon for the BBC this year. Sometimes you do think, wouldn't I like to just go and watch it, and just sit and spectate? But it's such a magical event. It really, really is. And on that very first morning, if anybody knows the geography of that area. But you drive down up from the top of Wimbledon Village, down, and laid out in front of you is the All England Club. Honestly, on that first Monday in July or whenever it happens to be, I do that every year, and I go, there is absolutely nowhere else in the world I'd rather be. It is fantastic.
Magical, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is.
Yeah,
It's great, yeah.
I know. But also, I know you have a love of horse racing, although I believe it hasn't
Yes.
always been your most successful endeavour.
Well, this is a money program. Here's a money tale that sadly is, this is Wall Street crashing and burning. I got back. I owned a quarter of a horse in 1996 that won a selling race at Leicester on the Monday as I was flying back from the Atlanta Olympics. And I got home, and in the days of answer phones, listened to the answer phone, and the horse had won, and it had been bought by Martin Pipe, one of the great national hunt racing trainers of all time. And on the Wednesday, I got a phone call from one of the other owners saying Martin Pipe would like to offer me a half share in this horse for £5,000. And actually, this horse had won at Leicester, and I thought, God, we've got rid of this damn thing, and we've probably just about broken even on it. So this, in horse racing terms, as anybody watching this who's ever owned a leg of a horse will tell you, that's you're really in, your quid's in,
That's
even though you're really done okay if you've come out of it, without anything in the debit column. So I hummed and hawed about it. I looked at it, and I just didn't have £5,000 to do it. So I rang back and said, look, I'm really sorry. I'd love to. I really, really would love to. I'd love to have had a horse with Martin Pipe because he was at the peak of his powers at the time as the sort of leader of racing, racehorse trainers. And anyway, I didn't. That was in August. The following March, when this horse called Make a Stand, having won 7 races and £1 million in prize money in the intervening period, won the Champion Hurdle at Cheltenham, and I was presenting the Champion Hurdle at Cheltenham and had to congratulate Peter and all those concerned on Make a Stand winning the Champion Hurdle. When all the way through I was thinking, this was my horse. It was almost my horse. I've loved horse racing all my life. This was my moment. And just for that relatively small investment, I haven't got anything for sure. And it was one of those terrible moments, really awful moments, that as Make a Stand was coming to the last flight of hurdles, and Cheltenham was with Wimbledon, Cheltenham, and probably the Millennium Stadium, the Principality Stadium in Wales. Those are my 3 great sort of citadels of sport. As Make a Stand was coming to the last flight, it was that terrible moment, that real kind of yin and yang moment about nice you is thinking, I'm so happy for Peter and for Martin and everybody, and Tony McCoy was riding. I'm so happy for them all that they're going to have one of the great moments in the sun. And the bad bit of you is going, I just hope it falls. No, I don't want anybody to get hurt, but I just hope it falls because then I might feel a whole lot better. But mercifully, I think the good side of me just about held sway.
Fantastic. Well, I assume, obviously, as your fame and your employment level increased, your income would increase. So, were you able to start putting some kind of investment and saving strategy in place as your career progressed?
I think my family would say to you that I have the business acumen of a pea. But I think, in terms of living in London, if you bought a house at the right time, when you probably couldn't afford to, you just got lucky, and that ends up being your equity. And I'm a great believer that, you don't take it with you. So I do tend to, what I get, I tend to try and spend on whatever it might be. So, having odd legs of racehorses, sponsoring my local rugby club, just all that sort of stuff. I'm not an investor as such, because I kind of think that, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So I always think money is kind of related to how you view life generally, and I think I'm a great believer in living each day as though it's your last. If you keep putting things away for a rainy day, you might never get there.
No, that's true enough. But I suppose, isn't there somewhat of a precarious nature to employment in the field you've chosen? So
Hugely. Listen, your contract is on we're freelancers. And at any moment somebody can say, yeah, you were good last year, but I think we need to change. And if you say why, there's often not a very rational argument. It's just we need to change. So as a consequence of that, yes, absolutely. You're here today, and you could be gone. You could be gone the day after tomorrow. So there is that. I think you'd probably just have to have a bit of faith in yourself. You think, well, actually, I've done this for so long now that if it all fell down tomorrow, I think I'd get something somewhere. I think somebody'd employ me, wherever it might be. I will go back and do the breakfast show on a local radio station and love it because it's great fun. But I'm not sure I'd be very keen on those 4 o'clock starts again, you know.
So you recently left Radio 5 after 25 years.
Yeah.
So you've got some time, I guess, and some mental space to think. What are the plans? What next for John Inverdale?
I really don't know. It's one of those interesting things about, you know, I stopped, but, you know, the old cliche about always leave a party while you're having fun. You know, and in those long lost days before Uber, the number of times I sat on roadsides at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, why the hell didn't you leave at midnight when somebody offered you a lift home? You know, just ridiculous. So I should have, you know, I just think, you just feel in your heart you've done it. There's nothing more to be done there. But also, I think you're just about young enough to throw yourself into something else. You've still got the energy and the desire and the will and the hunger to do it. Which perhaps if you left it another 3 or 4 years, you wouldn't do. So, you know, I literally, I mean, I've still got, you know, bits and bobs of contracts of television work all over the place. But I genuinely don't know. But it's quite interesting that the moment you say something like that, it's quite interesting how people suddenly ring you up and say, hi, remember we used to work together 14 years ago? Yeah, I do. We ought to have tea. So I think over the next fortnight, I think I've got 3 lunches and 2 meets in the pubs at 6 with people I've known over the last 20 odd years ago to discuss, who knows. So, which is actually quite exciting. You know, I mean, genuinely, it's like, you know, in 12 months' time, what might you be doing? I really don't know. But it's quite fun to think about it.
I mean, my impression is your first love is radio, and,
Yeah.
and there's a lot going on in the commercial radio space.
Well, I mean, radio, I do think one of the most extraordinary things about radio is not just its longevity, for obvious reasons, but its popularity. It is still, you know, in this super techno age where, you know, you can get everything on your watch and your glasses and God knows what else, people still love radio. They're loving radio almost more than they've ever loved radio. And I think that's because as we become, I think what's really interesting, you can get very deep about these things, but as we become more immersed in ourselves, that our whole lives are our tablet, we don't talk to anybody, we just talk to ourselves the whole time, or we talk to people on tablets or on phones. Actually, someone talking with you and talking in a world that you inhabit on the radio becomes a friend even more than they ever did before. So the relationship that you form with listeners is fantastic. And, you know, it's somebody that you've listened to for 20 years but have never met. When they announce they're leaving that programme, some part of you's gone. It's very strange.
It's like a bereavement.
It is. There is no logic to it at all.
Yeah.
You know, and I've often said that, you know, when somebody I listen to regularly on the radio goes on holiday, I almost want to ring them up and say, how dare you? You are an integral part. Every Thursday when I go to the gym, I listen to you on the way there. It is unacceptable for you to not be there this week. How dare you not do that? And so, and I think that relationship that you form between broadcaster and listener, across whatever it might be, is very, very important, and it's very personal. And it's one of those things, I think, if you're one half of it, as I've been lucky enough to be over the last, you know, 30, 40 years, it's not something you want to give up, you know, forever.
Okay, well, I think we await with great interest where life takes you next. John Inverdale, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And join us again next week on Money and Me for another financial life story. Thanks for watching.